Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I've just posted the handout in the chat feature if anyone didn't manage to download the handout. And the title of this shiur is Bilam, Magician or Prophet. So it's an attempt to have a look at Bilam and understand a little bit about what he was and what his role was, what exactly he, what function he served. This shiur is Le'iloi Nishmas, my grandfather, Meir ben Shimon, and it should be an Iloi Neshama for him and for my parents and for all of his descendants, for all our family. If we look at this week's Sedra, we meet the character of Bilam ben Ba'ur, who is hired by Balak to curse the Jewish people. Now, we're aware of the broad outline of the plot. Bilam is persuaded to go and curse the Jewish people. He asks permission from Hashem, who doesn't grant permission, and on the second attempt agrees to do so. And eventually he heads out with Ballak, encounters the Malach on the way, the story with the donkey, and eventually arrives at the encampment of the Jewish people in the desert, where he is moved to some of the most beautiful poetry in the Torah, beautiful psukim in the Torah, largely sung in praise of the Jewish people, in praise of Klal Yisrael. Now, what sort of abilities did Bilam have? Well, we meet him speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He seems able to consult Hashem, on the one hand. On the other hand, he is described as a magician. Indeed, if we look at the source sheet, in Pasuk Zayin, the Ziknei Moav and the Ziknei Midian in Pasuk 7 are described as setting out to meet Bilam with ksomim biyodom, with magic charms in their hands. And Bilam himself is later described as using nechoshim. Nechoshim are incantations or the like. We're not going to focus in this shiur on the various types of magic that are described, but Bilam himself is described as using these nechoshim. Interestingly, in Perek Kaf Daled, when Bilam sets out to yet again bless the Jewish people, by this stage he's given up on cursing them, and this is printed in source 2 in the handouts, which for those who are now joined, I'll place again in the chat the link to them. This time it says, Vayar Bilam ki tov be'enei Hashem levarich es Yisrael. This time Bilam sees that it pleases Hashem that he should bless Israel, and as a result, lo halach b'pam likras nechoshim. This time he doesn't go to seek nechoshim, magical spells, but instead the pasuk is described as the spirit of Hashem rests on him. And indeed, how does Bilam describe himself? In Pasuk Gimel he says, he lifts up his parable and he says, I am the man with an open eye. I have the ability to see things that others don't see. I'm someone who hears Hashem saying, and I have the vision of the Almighty, fallen yet with open eyes. So Bilam seems to be able to see and hear Hashem with open eyes. Very unusual language used. I note, by the way, that on the handout, I seem to have accidentally left in place the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So for those of you who have printed it, please note this will need disposal of in Shemus. I apologize for that. So this is what Bilam says. He describes himself as someone with remarkable prophetic ability in an unusual manner. So what was Bilam? Was he a prophet or a magician? And if he was a prophet, what level of prophet is he? After all, in the first part of the story, he's described as only being able to experience Hashem in a nighttime sleep of sorts. He seems to encounter malachim and yet not notice them initially. and yet later on he describes himself as someone who is able to see Hashem with Gilui Einayim, with open eyes, in an unusual manner. So Chazal pick up on Bilam's abilities, and on a comment, a very famous comment on the psukim in the end of Devarim that describe Moshe Rabbeinu's level of prophecy. And I printed this at the top of page 2 in the source sheets. The pasuk says, "V'lo kom novi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe." No prophet rose amongst the Jewish people like Moshe. And then it describes Moshe's ability, Asher yoda Hashem ponim el ponim. He knew Hashem face to face. So Moshe is an unusual prophet with remarkable abilities. He knows Hashem face to face. On this comments the Sifri, and the Sifri is well known. Sifri is a medrash on the pasuk in Devarim. V'lo kom novi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe. No novi arose like Moshe. B'Yisrael lo kom. The medrash picks up the nuance of the language. Amongst the Jewish people, there was no other novi like Moshe. Aval ba'omos ha'olam kom. Amongst the nations of the world, there did indeed arise such a prophet. If Eizezeh, who is this prophet? Zeh Bilam ben Be'er. This is Bilam, the son of Be'er. So here Bilam is described as a remarkable prophet, not just someone who is a prophet, but a prophet equivalent to the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, to the prophecy of Moshe. Now all this is very difficult. What are we meant to make of this? How did he achieve such a level of prophecy? And when did he achieve this level of prophecy? It would appear only at this point in time, when he ceases to be merely someone who reaches out to Nechoshim and Kusomim, ceases to be someone who is only able to experience divine revelation at night, but now is able to experience it in the day and at will when he chooses, which are, after all, the unique qualities possessed or described of Moshe Rabbeinu, who is able to speak to Hashem when he wants. At the end of Bahaloscha, when Hashem himself compares the prophecy of Moshe to that of regular prophets, one of the uniquenesses of Moshe is that he is able to have prophecy whenever he wishes, and Bilam appears to have the same function. He seems to be able to bring at will the Ruach Elokim on himself, and he's able to experience this with open eyes, Gilui Einayim, rather than just in sleep like others. So at this stage, by Bamidbar, chapter 24, by the later stage of Bilam's prophecies, by the time he's given up on using the Nechoshim and he's accepted, he's going to have to bless the Jewish people, he seems uniquely equipped with prophetic ability. Why did Bilam get this prophetic ability? Why was he granted this unique quality? So here we look at the bottom of page 1, where Rashi addresses this question, and again, a very well-known Rashi. The Im Toma, if one asks, bottom of page 1, why did Hashem choose to rest his divine presence on such a wicked non-Jew? Answers Rashi, so that the nations of the world won't have a complaint, an excuse. Loma, to say, had we had prophets, we would have gone back to the good. Therefore, Hashem says, I'm going to give you prophets, to impart together ha'olam, and they are going to not only not raise your moral level, but they will breach normal standards of morality. Initially, the people of Moab and Midian refrained from immorality, and Bilam advised them to behave in a totally immoral manner, as we find at the end of the Sedra, when the daughters of Moab behave in a style of prostitution in a terrible way. So basically, if the people of the world complain we didn't receive prophets, the response is, I gave you a prophet, Bilam, and look what he did. Not only did he do no good, but actually he did terrible harm. Now this is difficult on 2 levels. It's difficult firstly because if there is indeed a legitimate claim as to why the peoples of the world have not received a prophet, What is the response by giving them a Bilam? Well, of course, if you bestow prophecy on a rotter like Bilam, a Rasha, a wicked and evil man like Bilam, what do you expect? Of course, he's going to abuse his position of power and leadership and prophecy to corrode and corrupt his audience. So if there's something fair in the complaint that we have been mistreated, how is that resolved by giving them a Bilam? I mean, give them a leader, and hopefully this leader will be a force for moral good. Give them a Bilam, and of course they're going to be, such a leader is going to lead them further into depravity and immorality. So it's not fair. If they have a legitimate complaint there, they are treated unfairly, how does it help giving prophecy to a Bilam? This is one question. A more profound question is the nature of this prophecy, how the prophecy of Bilam works. And this question is at least a good question, an important question, according to the view of the Rambam. If one views prophecy as an arbitrary gift granted by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then perhaps we can understand that he chose to grant the gift of prophecy to Bilam himself. However, the Rambam understands, and this is really based on the Rambam's reading of a Gemara, that there are a number of conditions to prophecy being granted. In fact, the Rambam believes that prophecy is not in the least an arbitrary gift. Prophecy is the result of spiritual insight achieved through a clarity of vision based upon a series of exercises and character development and intellectual refinement that can be achieved by anyone who engages seriously with this. In fact, the Rambam in one point says, not in the source that I printed here, but elsewhere, the Rambam at one point says that prophecy is almost a natural phenomenon, in the sense that as soon as someone has achieved genuine spiritual grandeur, general spiritual growth of a special sort, and made themselves a transparent receptacle for clarity of vision and divine inspiration, prophecy will automatically come. And the non-granting of prophecy to individuals is the miraculous intervention. Automatically, almost by default, prophecy will be granted to anyone who has achieved the prophetic level. What is the prophetic level, says the Rambam? On that, he explains that all of us have mechitzot, barriers that intervene with our ability to see spiritual reality as it is. What are those barriers? Well, there are many layers. He says, mechitzah, there are many mechitzot, many layers of barrier. The most basic and primitive of these barriers are that of corruption of self. If we are people who are focused solely on that which is material, or on ourselves, and pleasure-seeking, and ego, and selfishness, and greed, and power, then we're of course not going to see the spiritual reality of the world. We're focused on that which is temporal and that which is limited, and perhaps we're not even focused on anything outside ourselves. Perhaps we're just so inward looking that we're oblivious to that which is beyond ourselves, to that which is outside. The analogy I've used before in the past is that of a person in a lit up room with large patio doors at the ends of the room, and it's nighttime outside. When the lights are on in the room and they look outwards, all they see is a reflection of themselves. When the lights go off in the room, now that there isn't a strong reflection being bounced back from outside, now they're able to see the dim and faint light coming through the patio doors, and they can see that outside is a wonderful garden. But when the lights are in the room, all they're able to see is the reflection of themselves, because the dim light outside is bottle barov, is nullified in the majority of light, which is coming bouncing back from these large patio doors and the lit up room inside. So if the lights are burning so brightly inside oneself, in this case, the lights of self-interest and self-focus, then the person won't be able to see that which is outside themselves. Similarly, if the person is not someone who has developed their capacity for thought and for reflection, and if they have a limited understanding and comprehension of the world, whether due to limited character development or limited ability or lack of effort and development in pursuit of insight and understanding, then again they may be able to see through the patio doors to the beautiful garden outside, but they are not going to understand what they see. So this is a second barrier that can exist, the barrier of foolishness. A third barrier that exists is by dint of being a material human being. By nature, we humans are material and physical, and we see that which is physical and material. We don't see to the depth, we don't see the idea, the form, the concept that lies behind that which is material, unless we expend effort on removing our understanding just of the external and the material and comprehend that which is going on inside the inner content. Look, this is the case with all sorts of phenomena in the natural world, and it's no less the case in the spiritual world. We can notice the expression on someone's face. We can notice the physical manifestation of the posture that someone is holding themselves in, but we may not understand the inner content of this, which is the mood or feelings or emotions that the person is undergoing. Similarly, we can notice a plant that is losing its color, or a field that isn't growing properly, and we cannot understand and comprehend the depth that lies behind it, which is the plant infection that it is receiving. We can go through life and see objects falling to the ground and not comprehend that there is a deeper meaning behind this. Is to a great scientist like Newton comes along and understands there's a law of nature, gravity at work, and so on and so forth. So we human beings naturally see that which is external and physical, and we don't notice the inner content. And this is yet another barrier to comprehension. Says the Rambam, imagine we could strip away barrier after barrier, and we would remove the barriers of ego and selfishness and greed and power seeking and lust and so on and so forth. Imagine we would develop our intellect, and we would genuinely use our natural abilities combined with effort to pursue insight and reflection and understanding. Imagine we trained ourselves to see the inner contents of everything and what the message behind it really is. Imagine we aligned our behavior, our character traits, our functioning with these ideas and comprehension that we had arrived at, so that we were a person who was operating fully in accord with these values. Then we would have removed significant mechitzot, significant barriers from our comprehension, and we would be able more clearly to see that garden that lies outside the patio doors at the end of our lounge. We would be able to see the world as it really is. And what is the world really? What would we be able to see? We would be able to see the spiritual dimension that lies behind things. And were we to develop this far enough, we would eventually be able to hear the voice of Nevuah, the voice of prophecy. In other words, in the Rambam's model, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is speaking, he's broadcasting constantly. But we need the receptors to hear. We need to pick up the right bandwidth and have the right equipment to be able to hear that which is being said. However, there are mechitzas, there are barriers which intervene between us and our ability to hear. Says the Rambam, this explains the different levels of prophecy that exist and the uniqueness of Moshe's prophecy. Moshe is the figure who has most removed the barriers that intervene. Lesser prophets have removed some of these barriers. Lesser prophets therefore have a clarity of vision that is somewhat clouded by their remaining flaws, by their remaining limitations, by the remaining lack of sufficient reflection, by the remaining lack of alignment of themselves and their midot and their behavior with their values. They're not perfect, no one is perfect. Nonetheless, these are great human beings who have a vision, not an asplakaria ha'me'ira, not a clarity of vision. Asplakaria ha'me'ira means a clear crystal, seen through a clear sheet of glass. But they're looking through a sheet of glass that's somewhat clouded, somewhat moist, has fingerprints all over it. They're able to see through it, but without a perfect clarity. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, sees through an asplakaria ha'me'ira. He sees through a perfectly clear sheet of glass. Because he is Omav Michal Adam, he is the most modest of all humans. It's not coincidence that he possesses these two qualities of modesty and clarity of vision and nevuah, because the two go together. He has rid himself of all barriers that are possible for a human being to rid themselves of. He has achieved an alignment of midas and behavior and lack of ego and clarity of work and intellectual comprehension and so on, such that he has a near perfect vision of the spiritual world. What is left? What is lacking still in his vision? Only the last barrier, only the last mechitza, in that he is ultimately a human being, and that he ultimately sees through a sheet of glass. Even the clearest glass will somewhat, in a very small level, blur the vision. Moshe davens to Hashem, and he says, Hareini nos kvodecha, I want to see your honor in the full glory. And on that, Hashem says, there will always be for a living human being, just by dint of being a material human being, something of a barrier that remains. But other than that, Moshe has achieved the greatest clarity of vision possible. And David asked over here, did the Rambam consider that he had personally been able to strip away these barriers and receive Nevuah? It's a really, really interesting question. I don't know what made you ask that question, whether you've done some reading around this topic or not. It is possible that the Rambam did consider himself to have been potentially able to receive Nevuah, but not receiving it due to the historic times in which he lived and the cessation of prophecy due to the circumstances. It's a longer discussion as to what Madrega the Rambam considered himself to have reached and his own personal avodas Hashem. It's a very, very interesting question, David. Maybe one day I will give a share on the Rambam's relationship to avodas Hashem. We have a lot of evidence about it from letters he wrote and the like, and also from a beautiful work of his son, a handbook of self-work and mussar that his son Rabbi Zobin and Rambam wrote. And it is possible that the Rambam considered himself somewhat along the path towards this. And the Rambam is writing this as practical Nevuah. In other words, the Rambam believes this is something that everyone should strive towards. We should all strive to achieve spiritual insight. And the greatest spiritual insight is the clarity of Nevuah and prophecy. I printed a summary of these ideas. I'm not going to go through it now because of the limits of time. From the Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos. The Rambam wrote an 8-chapter introduction to Pirkei Avos. The introduction to Pirkei Avos that he wrote is considerably longer than the book of Pirkei Avos itself, the 5 chapters of Mishnah Avos. And in the 7th chapter of his introduction, the Rambam writes about this idea, and I printed this in the source sheets. I'm not going to go through it now. Now, if we understand, like the Rambam, that prophetic revelation is a result of a declouding of self, of the creation of clarity of vision, achieved only by someone who has perfected their midas, who has removed self-centeredness and ego and greed and lust and power from themselves, that they're able to see the world with clarity. What sense are we to make of a Bilam? Not only is Bilam a prophet, not only is he a Novi, but he is a Novi who arguably achieves something in some way analogous to the Madrega, to the heights of prophecy that Moshe Rabbeinu himself achieves. So how on earth are we meant to understand that? So this is a second question on this stream of Midrashim that we cited by the Sifri, cited by Rashi, that seem to ascribe to Bilam a significant level of prophecy. And this indeed seems to be the Pashtus, the simplest understanding of Psukim, in which Bilam seems to genuinely receive Ruach Elokim as per 24:2, which we cited in source 2. How are we meant to understand all of this? So one way of answering this question is by understanding the nature of Bilam. And there's many ways to express this idea. I want to express it using the language of Medrash. And in source 5 on page 2, I printed a series of Midrashim and Agadah Gemaras, which all take as their theme a link between Bilam on the one hand and Lavan on the other hand. And they all say this in different forms. One source, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, says that Bilam ben Be'er, Bilam the son of Be'er, who is Be'er? He is Lavan. So Bilam is a descendant of Lavan. The Zohar, printed in source 5, the second source, says Bilam is Bar Bered Lavan. He is the grandson of Lavan. Lavan's an ancestor of his. The Targum Yonason ben Uziel, I mentioned in previous weeks the Targum Yonason, the more famous Targum Unclus is an Aramaic translation ascribed to Unclus. Targum Yonason is a more Midrashic Aramaic translation ascribed to Yonason ben Uziel. He says, again, really based on other sources, also other Midrashim and Gemaras, Lavan Arami, who Bilam? Lavan is Bilam himself. Now, whenever we see Midrashim that link historic characters together in this way, we need to understand what the Midrash is doing, and whether the Midrash is teaching us just history or something beyond that. What do these sources mean when they say that Bilam is Lavan, or at least is a descendant of Lavan? So possibly they mean this literally, or possibly they are indicating some sort of confluence or commonality between the two. Whether the Medrash means that Lavan is Bilam, whether it means that Bilam is, according to other sources, a Gilgal, an incarnation of Lavan, these are mystical matters. But what the Medrash is telling us is that there's a commonality between the two. They share a shorish neshama, they share a soul force. There's something very reminiscent of each other. And I think we can see and understand what the commonality is. Both the figures seem to be famed for their dishonesty, their corrosion, their moral corruptness, and the like. But the Medrash is seeing something deeper and more profound than that in linking of the two. Now, Lavan is the shakran, the liar, the ramoi, the deceiver par excellence. In fact, according to the Medrash, he's called Lavan because he is whiter than white. He presents himself as cleaner than clean. He's someone who's completely transparent. He's completely at one with himself and comfortable in his own skin. Were Lavans who have been put through a lie detector test, he would have passed with flying colours, because lie detectors work by picking up the tensions that one experiences as one tells an untruth. One sweats a little, one tenses a little, one's heartbeat goes up, because one feels a conflict, one is bifurcated, one is torn. We have a natural truth instinct, and for whatever reason, to achieve monetary goals or defend ourselves from accusations of crime, whatever it is, we choose to lie, and we feel tense in so doing. Lavan would have passed every lie detector test because he's completely relaxed, completely calm. He feels no conflict whatsoever because he's completely okay with lying. He lives in a world devoid of any interest in truth, and therefore he's white, he's clean, he's completely relaxed, he's completely okay. Bilam shares this quality. Bilam is so disinterested in taking insight and vision and clarity and awareness and comprehension and translating it into action, that there's no conflict. He's able to see and perceive truth and spirituality. He's able to experience the ruach of Hashem resting on him. He's able to achieve prophetic insight with complete clarity, because nothing in him means that he blocks that vision. He feels no conflict in so doing it. The Rambam explains that for a typical person, in fact for everyone other than a Bilam, their desires, their lust, their greed, their ego, their search for power interferes with their clarity of vision, because we're all like that. We need to justify and rationalize our behavior. We're not able to live with acknowledging I'm completely wrong. I'm okay with that. I don't care. I still want this. What do we need to say? We need to blind our ability, limit our ability to see the truth as it is in order to live with ourselves. So rather than saying I'm completely wrong, yes, I have no right to this, but I still want it. I'm going to take it. I'm completely okay with that. We rationalize. It's a good argument why I should have it. It really belongs to me. It's really okay. It really should be mine. And with that, we cloud our vision. So our moral failings act as barriers because they cloud our vision, because we can't live with our moral failings. But if someone is completely amoral, completely devoid of any interest in translating any insight into practice, they have no reason to cloud their vision. If what they understand is going to impose on them demands and expectations, then they may indeed block comprehension and understanding. But Bilam has a complete clarity of vision because he's completely disinterested. What he understands and what he sees has no effect on how he's going to operate and what he's going to see. And therefore, he's going to be able to achieve this level of prophecy. But how does Bilam get there? What allows someone to have got such a complete moral breakdown? And what's the answer to our original question, in which the peoples of the world complain we didn't have a prophet, and Hashem says, I'll give you a prophet, Bilam, and let's see what happens with him. How can they be blamed when they're given a Bilam? And here lies the tragedy of Bilam, because he didn't start off as a Bilam. He started off granted a great gift of prophecy, a low level of prophecy, a man of some insight, in response to the complaint that they have no prophets. But what happens if you grant someone insight and clarity when they are from the Umos Ha'olam, when they're not interested in accepting the Torah, when they don't want to take that change and put it into practice? They are living a contradiction at that point. And to be able to live with the contradictions, have an awareness and not live up to it, means one has to distance oneself, one has to harden oneself, one has to create a gap, one has to rupture one's inner unity and say, even though this is what I understand, this isn't how I want to act. The complaint of the Umos Ha'olam is, We would have been better without joining Klal Yisrael. We didn't want the Torah. We don't want the Torah. We were offered the Torah and don't want it. But had we had insight, had we had vision, had we had prophecy, we would still be better. Says Hashem, if you achieve insight, if you achieve prophecy, but you're not willing to change, you're not willing to put it into action, which is what Torah is about, the world of mitzvahs and actions and real deeds, then not only will the prophecy not leave you neutral and won't elevate you as per your complaint, but it will corrode and corrupt you. Because the only way to deal with clarity of vision, of spiritual insight, is either to change or to harden oneself, to distance oneself. Every moment of inspiration we achieve in life is fantastic and an opportunity, but also very dangerous. Because if we receive that inspiration and act on it, great, we've grown from it. But if we receive the inspiration and don't act on it, we've distanced ourselves a bit more. We've cut some of ourselves off. We haven't allowed the emotion. We've hardened our hearts. We've remained aloof. We've trained ourselves to be removed from the spiritual experience. And this is the tragedy of what happens to Bilam. He goes from being a petty little magician with some small spiritual insight. And the inspiration and the vision and the revelation and the clarity of thought he has drives him ever further away. He has to bifurcate himself and cut himself off yet further and more profoundly from his ideas and from his understanding. The greater his mind grows, the more spiritually aware it becomes, the more he has to cut the rest of himself off. Because otherwise he's living in contradiction. Otherwise he can't live with himself. How can he have all that clarity and not change? But he isn't willing to change. And if you're not willing to change, then you become a Bilam. Till eventually he becomes the evil twin of Moshe Rabbeinu. He has the perfect clarity, the perfect vision, and he achieves that not through the modesty and greatness of emotion and the willingness to change, but through the complete cessation, the complete gap he's created between that which he understands and that which he does. And this is the response Hashem is saying to them, you want a prophet, I'll give you, but you should realize that prophecy without Torah, insight without action is dangerous and breeds the creation of a Lovon, a person who's completely at one with untruth, a Bilam who's completely okay with having the spirit of Hashem resting on him, with being Goloi, with being able to see all the clarity of vision, as he says, Goloi Einayim, and yet completely cut off from any consequences of that which he sees. So I'll stop there for the Parsha section of this week's Sedra, with what I think is a very beautiful and profound and important idea in understanding Bilam, and we'll now shift to the halachic section, in which we continue to deal with Hilchos Shabbos and warming up food, and that which one can and can't do on Shabbos and before Shabbos in heating food. Now, we dealt with, in the previous weeks, the concept of Shiur, leaving things on the flame before Shabbos, and the concept of Chazorah, putting things onto the flame on Shabbos. We saw that as far as Torah law is concerned, Shiur, I should be able to leave anything on the flame before Shabbos. I'm doing it before Shabbos, what on earth would be the problem? Nonetheless, rabbinically, I can't do so because of the fear of ending up tweaking the flame and altering the cooking process. And therefore, there's a series of rabbinic protections put in place. And similarly, we saw with Chazorah, in theory, if something is fully cooked, I should be able to put it on the flame to reheat it on Shabbos. Nonetheless, rabbinically, I'm not allowed to do so. That's with dry food. With wet food, maybe the heating is the Bishul itself, maybe not. With dry food, reheating is certainly not Bishul, certainly not the Malacha of Bishul, the prohibited Shabbos activity, Torah activity of cooking. Nonetheless, rabbinically, it's forbidden because it looks like cooking. I experience this with cooking. And again, therefore, there's rules that's in place. I need a Blech and the upturned pot. Or if I've just temporarily taken it off, I need to have taken it off temporarily, held it in my hands before I put it back on the flame. And what I would like to do today is finish off understanding how the Blech works and what you can and can't do on a Blech. And then after that, look at another Erev Shabbos prohibition, which is the prohibition of Hatmana or insulating. So we're basically working our way through the rabbinic element of Bishul. And the theme is looking at things that you can't do on Shabbos, before Shabbos, even though everything should be permitted before Shabbos, and on Shabbos, even with fully cooked foods. Now, we discussed the concept of Shiur, of not leaving food on before Shabbos, unless there is a Blech, a cover to the flame, or it's a hot plate which isn't ever used, isn't normally used for cooking. We discussed a hot plate in our last Shiur and the Shiur before that. I didn't clarify exactly what a Blech is. other than saying it's a cover. And there aren't really halachas around the nature of this cover. It is sufficient that the flame is covered. If one finds oneself blechless, one can use a thick sheet of aluminium foil to cover also, though one has to be careful in terms of danger and ensure that the flame, it's removed enough from the flame that it won't overheat and catch a light. One should also avoid adjusting the flame once the blech is in place, because the whole logic of a blech is I've now removed myself from adjusting the flame and I've finished that stage of cooking where I'm tweaking the flame and I'm just leaving food on to carry on doing its own thing. And therefore, once one has put the blech on, one shouldn't adjust it. Now, in addition, I mentioned this briefly and I want to elaborate on this. The point of a blech is to leave food that isn't fully cooked on the flame. If the food is fully cooked, you don't need a blech. Nonetheless, best practice is to have food fully cooked with a blech before Shabbos. Why should it be fully cooked? Sorry, why should it be with a blech even if it's fully cooked? The answer is because fully cooked is not so clear cut. It's possible that further heating leads to an improvement, and at least l'chatchila, ideally speaking, food should be fully cooked if it doesn't have a blech. What about the other way around? If I have a blech, why should the food be fully cooked? Surely the whole point of a blech is that the food doesn't need to be fully cooked. And the answer is this is correct. If one has a blech, the food doesn't need to be fully cooked. Nonetheless, good kitchen policy is to have food fully cooked before Shabbos. And the reason for this is because if I move around food on the blech, I reposition food on the blech, and I move it from a less hot place on the blech to a hotter place on the blech, I may speed up the cooking process. And therefore, it's better that food should be fully cooked before Shabbos so that there are no concerns with moving the food around. So this is the reason why food should be fully cooked before Shabbos and left on the blech. In addition, there are other potential Torah prohibitions that I could do with food that's not fully cooked, such as other ways of speeding up cooking. And here we come to another rabbinic prohibition, which is called megis, stirring food. Stirring food mixes the food and causes more even distribution of heat because not every area of the pot is evenly heated. And if I stir uncooked food on Shabbos, I'm possibly accelerating the cooking process called makari Bishul. I'm causing the cooking process to happen faster and therefore might be transgressing, God forbid, the Torah prohibition of cooking on Shabbos by speeding up the cooking process. Food which is fully cooked but still on the flame, logically speaking, should be allowed to be stirred. Why should it be allowed to be stirred? Because it's already cooked. And therefore, if I'm stirring it in order to avoid something getting burned or the like, or to ensure that it's even heated, what would be the problem with this? Nonetheless, according to many poskim, stirring food on the flame, even though it's fully cooked, is forbidden. Why would it be forbidden if it's fully cooked? Surely nothing further can happen. And the answer is it's a rabbinic prohibition, either because it looks like cooking, it's another type of mechsi kamavashel, it looks like cooking, or really to say the same idea in different language, it's equivalent to chazorah, to putting something onto the flame in the first instance. If I take something off the flame, I can't put it back unless I held onto it and I had intention and so on. Certainly, if something has been in the fridge or completely off the flame before Shabbos and now I want to put it on, I can't do so unless it's on an upturned pot or the like. And therefore, stirring something is basically drawing something, part of the cooking food, nearer to the flame, and perhaps therefore has an element of chazorah. And therefore, l'chatchila, we don't stir food on the flame on Shabbos, even if it's fully cooked. But certainly, if it's not fully cooked, there is the risk of literally causing the cooking to occur, which would be literally Bishul on Shabbos. More than that, the general psak in the UK and in America is not to remove food directly from a pot on Shabbos either. And this is in line with the simplest understanding of the major poskim, that removing food from a pot also has these same problems. If the food is not fully cooked, by reducing the volume of food in the pot, I'm accelerating the Bishul process, I'm drawing the Bishul process close. And if I remove food from a fully cooked pot, I'm almost inevitably engaging in some process of stirring of megis, and therefore one shouldn't do so. In Israel, where the psak of the Chazon Ish dominates, the Chazon Ish is more lenient in this matter, and it does allow one to remove food from a pot that is fully cooked on Shabbos. However, this is not the general psak in the rest of the world. The Chazon Ish is known very often for his chumras, for his stringencies. If one chooses to follow the psak of the Chazon Ish, one can do so in general. In which case one would need to take on the Chazon Ish Shiurim and the Chazon Ish chumras also. One can't necessarily pick and choose psak. But I just mention this because those of you who have visited may have it a little differently. The mainstream psak is that one shouldn't even remove food directly from the flame on Shabbos. If it's an emergency situation, you have a very large pot that you can't lift off the flame and you need to get access to it and it is fully cooked, one can rely on the Chazon Ish. Similarly, while a pot is on the flame on Shabbos, one shouldn't put the lid on if one has taken the lid off, or initially to put the lid on. Why not? Again, the same issues. If the food is not fully cooked, I'm speeding up the cooking process, and therefore it's potentially Torah prohibited. If the food is fully cooked, then there's no Torah prohibition in doing so. However, there is the possibility, again, of a rabbinic prohibition because it's speeding up the cooking, the continued heating of the food. So these are things that one needs to be aware of, and it's for this reason that good kitchen policy is certainly to have all food fully cooked before Shabbos. Some other applications of these principles that we've learned, just to common cooking scenarios. Returning food to a pot on Shabbos that's on the flame or off the flame. So let's say I have a large cholent pot, and I take some of the cholent out and I put it into a serving bowl and serve it on Shabbos at my meal. And there's some leftovers which I wish to return to the pot. So let's analyze the story. Well, if the cholent is wet, is liquid, it's a very liquidy cholent, and the cholent in the serving bowl has cooled down, by returning it to the main cholent pot, I may be now bringing the heat back to above the insulating. In fact, this is the presumption. If it's been for a significant amount of time in the serving bowl, it will have cooled down. I return it back to the pot, which has a large amount of cholent in it. I will put it back to Yad Soletes, and therefore I'm reheating cold liquid. This is a problem. If it's dry, a thicker, drier cholent, then there's no problem with bringing it back to heat, and I'd be allowed to return it to the main pot. However, this is all in a situation where the main pot is off the flame, and I'm not planning to return it to the flame. If I'm planning to return it to the flame, the main pot itself I can return because I just removed it temporarily with intention to return. But the food that's been in the serving bowl, by definition, hasn't been held by me the whole time, didn't have the intention to return, and therefore, if I put it back in the pot, I can't put that pot back on the flame, or that will be the rabbinic prohibition of chazorah that we discussed last time. So this is another scenario relevant to these halachas, returning something back to the pot. So we've discussed the rabbinic prohibition, or perhaps Torah prohibition in some cases, of removing food from a pot, stirring a pot, or putting a lid on a pot because of speeding up cooking, and now we're talking about chazorah. I should perhaps have added that stirring is only rabbinically prohibited in a case where it has some solids, because that causes it to mix and a more even distribution of heat. A pure liquid you can stir, because the nature of liquid is that there's convection current, and it effectively stirs itself as the heat rises and goes through the pot, and therefore one would be allowed to stir in this case. Just a couple of other scenarios that sometimes come up, which I'll mention very briefly. What about transferring from pot to pot? So very briefly, can I take food out of the oven and put it on the Blech? And the answer is yes. If it was in the oven, and we discussed when the nature of using ovens and leaving food in from before Shabbos, and the various possible problems there with opening the oven door and what happens in a situation where I've left food in the oven in a permissible manner, I can take the food out of the oven and put it on the Blech. This is not a problem of, there's no problem in so doing, because as long as the food itself is still hot, and as long as the oven was still hot, so it was on a heat source, I'm simply transferring it from one heat source to another heat source, and this isn't a problem. It effectively was always in contact with the heat source, and the prohibitions of chazorah don't apply. If the food is still warm, Or if it's cold and a solid, then I can put it on an upturned pot, but the oven has cooled down. Then it's chazara. I'm taking it from a non-heat source, putting it onto a heat source, and therefore I would have to put it on top of an upturned pot. But if the oven is still hot, I can transfer it. Similarly, I can add water to my cholent from my oven, my Shabbos kettle or my Shabbos urn. Why can I do so? Because when the hot water is on the Shabbos kettle, it's above a heat source, it's on the flame, and I'm taking it from one flame, one heat source, and putting it in another heat source. And therefore, as long as my cholent pot is also on top of a blech, I'm allowed to put the heat food onto it because it's going from one heat source to another heat source, and there wouldn't be a problem in so doing. And here we get to an interesting halachic discussion. If I transfer it directly from the urn to the cholent pot, by pouring it from the Shabbos kettle, the urn, to the cholent pot, then it has gone from a kli rishon on the flame onto a kli rishon onto the flame, no problem at all. If, however, I can't directly transfer it from my urn, because my urn is heavy and the cholent pot is heavy, I may want to do it via another utensil. So I pour water out from the urn into another utensil, a kli sheni, and then I put it back into the cholent pot. In this case, it's a little more debatable whether it would be allowed or not. On the one hand, I removed it from the flame with intention to put it straight back onto the flame. On the other hand, I went via a second utensil, a kli sheni, and therefore maybe this is prohibited. This remains somewhat of a halachic discussion, but the consensus is that this is okay, because effectively I'm just going via another utensil, but with the intention of warming and going straight from one flame to another flame. Effectively, I'm doing nothing. I'm taking hot water on the flame and putting it into a cholent pot above a blech on the flame, and there shouldn't be a problem with this. So this is a summary of some of the leftover halachas that we didn't finish off last week in terms of things I can and can't do with a blech. Just to summarize, so this is completely clear, general best practice is, if in doubt, don't tamper with your pot on the blech or on the flame. Don't stir it, don't put the lid in it, don't remove food from it. Take it off the flame off the blech, take out what you want, keep hold of it, have intention that you're going to return it, and then you can put it back on the flame and you avoid all these problems. That's summary number one. Summary number two is you can transfer directly from the contents of one pot on the flame, on the blech, to another pot on the blech, or even from something in the oven onto the blech. You can't do the other way around. You can go downgrade your level of heat, but not upgrade it. So you can't go from the blech to the oven because the oven is an uncovered heat source. However, you can go from the oven to the blech in a situation where, as discussed in previous weeks, one is allowed to use the oven. At this point, I want to take a pause and look at a completely separate rabbinic prohibition that applies on Erev Shabbos and Shabbos itself. Again, we discussed previously that everything should be allowed on Erev Shabbos because it doesn't matter what I'm doing before Shabbat. This is what I'm doing on Shabbos itself. You're allowed to have time switches set before Shabbos. Why should there be a problem? And we said because of rabbinic concern that you're putting yourself in a position where you may end up tampering with a pot on Shabbos. And we spoke now about tampering on Shabbos, stirring and mixing and the potential issues. There is another family of prohibitions that connect to what one can do on Erev Shabbos and Shabbos. And these are the prohibitions of Hatmana, or insulating. And the basic halachic principle is as follows. I can't do insulating on Shabbos. Any insulating that falls under the category of Hatmana, which we'll clarify in a few moments. That's halacha A. On Shabbos itself, I can't do any full insulation. And on Erev Shabbos, I can't do one specific sort of insulation, which is insulation where the insulator is adding heat. So on Shabbos itself, I can't insulate even neutral insulation, which is a heat preserver. And on Erev Shabbos, I can't wrap something with a heat adder, with something that adds heat to the insulated item. What's called Mosif Hevel in Halacha. Why is insulating prohibited? The answer is because the whole point of insulating is to preserve heat. I want to make sure it's warm enough. And since I'm engaged with keeping food warm, Chazal was scared that if I found that it had cooled down, I might forget that it's a Shabbos and possibly put the food on a flame, in which case it will be Bishul, or perhaps tamper with a flame, in which case it will be Mavir by adding fuel to the fire or elevating the flame or the like. And therefore, Hatmana, insulating, is a matter of halachic concern rabbinically. So let's go through each scenario one by one. What can I not do on Shabbos? The answer is any full insulating, even if it's just a wrap, it's just a neutral insulator. As long as this is a full insulation. What defines a full insulation? Maximum heat of the object being insulated and the fullest type of insulation around it. That means to say the food has to be in an original container, a prohibition, effectively, the original container in which it was heated, and it has to be completely enveloped, completely insulated, which basically means that it has to be wrapped all the way around and with a direct wrapping, where the wrapping is in direct contact with the surface of the food or the surface of the container of the food. Finally, I have to be doing it with the intention to create Hatmana. So if it's not in the original container, Hatmana doesn't apply. This is the reason, for example, why thermos flasks are not a problem. On Shabbos, I can transfer hot water from my urn into the thermos flask. If, let's say, the flame goes out under the hot water and I want to keep it warm, I'm insulating. It is a full insulator. It's an excellent insulator. It's a thermos flask. I'm doing it because I want to insulate. Nonetheless, it is permitted because it's a cliché, the thermos flask. I'm not insulating the original object that was heated up in. The whole logic of the prohibition of Hatmana is in case I come to heat food. This is a fear with a cliché. With a cliché, there isn't such a fear. The thermos flask won't be reheated, and therefore there's no insulation problem unless I'm wrapping the original pot. So again, let's go through our scenario. I discover that my flame has gone out on Shabbos. I obviously can't relight the flame. So what do? Well, the hot water I can pour out of my urn into the thermos flask. This is a second KD, a cliché, no problem with Hatmana. What happens if I want to wrap my soup in the blankets to keep it warm? Well, here we do have a potential problem with Hatmana. It's the klirishin, it's the original utensil being wrapped, and I'm doing it with intention to insulate, so it ticks those boxes. But we also need to make sure it's a complete insulation, which means to say it needs to be wrapped directly around the soup box. And in addition, I have to wrap a total enwrapment. It has to be completely wrapped. If it's partially covered, that doesn't mean I've left a square inch, but I've covered it in a manner in which in normal insulation, too much would be exposed. There's a significant amount that is left uncovered, then it is permitted. So let's say, for example, I have an ice box, a large ice box, which is made of insulating material. I can put my soup bowl, my soup pot into that large ice box and put the lid on, and there wouldn't be a problem because it's not completely wrapped, because there's a gap between the insulating material and the pot. And the box is box-shaped, square-shaped, considerably larger than my pot. And the pot isn't completely enveloped in it, and therefore it's not Hatmana. So the conditions of Hatmana are complete envelopment, direct envelopment, complete envelopment, intention to wrap, and klirishin. Thermos flask, not a problem because it's klisheni. Wrapping the soup pot is a problem because it's klirishin. However, if I only partially wrap it with a blanket, even though that's an enveloping material, it's only partially wrapped, I've left a significant amount unwrapped. Or I wrap it, for example, I don't wrap it, I put it in a removed insulating material like a freezer box, an insulating box, an insulator box, then this would be allowed because this wouldn't be the Hatmana that we are referring to. So this is Hatmana on Shabbos itself. Hatmana on Erev Shabbos is even more lenient, and it's only when I'm wrapping it in something which adds heat. So I don't know if there are such devices out there on the market, but if I had a heat blanket of sorts in which I wrap the food in order to warm it up, that would be an example of Hatmana that is prohibited on Erev Shabbos. Similarly, if I immerse a pot in hot water, I think there's devices that do this where you immerse something in a sort of a type of a hot water tub. Perhaps, I don't know how you pronounce it, a sous vide machine, S-O-U-S-V-I-D-E. If someone can tell me how that's pronounced, a sous vide machine, which is I know this because I've been sent a lot of shilas around it and I've only ever seen it written. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, which is a plastic bag that contains food and the whole bag is immersed in a liquid. This is Hatmana, where something is mosif hevel, it's wrapped and enveloped in a heat source which adds heat, then this would be a problem. Similarly, if I wrap my soup pot completely in a neutral blanket, not one that adds heat, but it's all sitting on the flame, then again, there would be a problem even on Erev Shabbos, because it's completely enveloped, it's directly wrapped, and there's a heat source which is heating it up. So this is a heat-adding insulation, which is prohibited on Erev Shabbos. So to summarize, even non-heat-adding insulation prohibited on Shabbos, only heat-adding insulation prohibited on Erev Shabbos, and in both cases, a number of conditions apply, only with intent to do Hatmana, only where it is enveloped, direct contact, and only where it is wrapped, totally wrapped, or where there's no significant area that is unwrapped. We've run out of time for today, but next week we'll look at some scenarios where this is relevant, such as a crock pot potentially, such as warming babies' bottles on Shabbos by immersing them in water, such as this sous vide machine, which is we'll look at in a little bit more halachic detail, and other situations of Hatmana. That's what we will discuss next week, and hopefully also then move on to some of the other heating halachas that are relevant on Shabbos, such as using hot water in washing up, showering or bathing or swimming in hot water, and various other scenarios of using hot water. But I will conclude here for today, and as always, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thank you, Rabbi Zobin.